Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So today we're going to pick up with starting off with this quote. And it says, "The ecological niche of an organism depends not only on where it lives, but also on what it does. By analogy, it may be said that the habitat is the organism's address, and the niche is its profession, biologically speaking." So we're going to talk today about the idea of this niche, and it can be a tricky thing for kids to understand because we're talking about the organism's place in its environment. And so a lot of kids will think habitat characteristics as opposed to really diving into what that niche actually means. So when we talk about habitat versus niche, what are we getting at here? Well, the niche is the place where the organism lives, right? And that's generally pretty easy for kids to get. So a squid lives in the ocean, a lion lives on the savanna, right? White-tailed deer live in deciduous forests. This habitat provides them with the energy, the water, the shelter, the living space that they need for their survival. So when we look at their habitat, it's the food sources that they have, it's the fact that the food exists, that they live in particular climates and are adapted to that, so on and so forth. Organisms absolutely adapt to their habitat. If that habitat changes, either they are capable as a population to adapt with it or they're not. So when we look at their habitat and we look at the suite of traits that a characteristic or an organism, I should say, is characteristic for, it is very much driven by evolution and has changed and modified that organism based on the habitats that they live in. So picking up a polar bear and trying to throw it in the middle of the Sahara Desert isn't going to go very well. It's not adapted to that habitat. The niche, on the other hand, includes all of those factors that a species needs to survive, to stay healthy, and to reproduce. So that niche is very much tied to the environmental conditions that make up its habitat. The difference here, though, is that a niche is determined by these things called tolerance limitations or limiting factors. So it really is the role that that species plays in its community. So is it a top predator? Is it somewhere else in the food chain? Is it a primary producer? Does it fix nitrogen from the air into the soil so that plants can go through and create their own amino acids so that they can make proteins? Those are the niches. What is its role? What is its job in that environment? And it is determined by those limiting factors, so any abiotic or biotic factor that restricts the existence of an organism in a specific environment. So the food sources that it eats, the compounds that it's dependent on, the compounds that it produces that are necessary for other organisms, all of that kind of stuff is what plays into this niche. So some examples of limiting factors might include the amount of water that's it's required. I'm not going to be able to take a particular plant out of a tropical rainforest and plant it in a desert, right? A cactus is going to do really well in a desert because it's been adapted to, it's evolved to work in low water conditions. I go throwing it into the middle of a tropical rainforest and it's basically going to drown because there's too much water at once. The amount of food that's necessary, the temperatures. So a lot of this will look similar to those habitat conditions, but it goes one step beyond that. And so species share their habitats, share their resources, but when I look at a niche, I'm looking specifically at what that organism is most adapted to surviving and gathering and providing within its own ecosystem. And a lot of this is going to come back to the way that competition occurs. So if I look at two plant species that might grow next to each other, they might very well be able to survive in that particular set of habitat conditions absent of its competitive partner. But I throw the additional species in there and now those niches are going to get adjusted. So somebody might be really good at growing at low light where the other one absolutely requires it. And so they will compete and adjust to that niche. Another great example, and I think I'll use this when we get to competition later, is different bird species, songbirds, and where they live within a tree. And they will actually divvy it out. So although a particular bird species could potentially live anywhere on any of those branches in a big tree, that's more of its habitat. Its actual niche then may get limited to just above the ground because that's where it's best able to obtain its resources and compete, where that other species might be really good at utilizing resources at the top of the tree. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that idea of competition and how that drives the niche that they're capable of living in, the role that they're capable of playing within their environment when we get to talking a little bit more about competition.
Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and in this podcast, I'm going to talk about this word right here. Ecological, well, it depends on where you live. Some people call it a niche. Some people call it a niche, and some people even call it a niche. And so I tend to call it a niche, but I think that's kind of an American thing. And so whatever we call it, it's derived from a French word which simply means nest. And so a good way to think about a niche is basically your role in an environment. And if we look right here, we see a couple of niches being exploited. And so we've got a rock here, and then we've got lichen that's growing on the rock. And so I can actually see 4 species here because lichen is not one species. It's actually a symbiotic relationship between an algae and a fungus, and they can't live by themselves. But I can see this green lichen, and then I also see this orange lichen growing right here. And they're both exploiting a different niche or a different job. And so one of the first scientists to come up with a good definition for a niche is this guy, George Hutchinson. I love his hair, and I've never been able to figure out what kind of an animal he's holding. It looks maybe like a cat or a monkey. But he defined it as an n-dimensional hypervolume, and so that seems like a crazy term. So what's he really talking about? Well, he's saying let's put on one side some biotic factor or abiotic factor. Let's say on this side we put sunlight, and on this side we put moisture. Well, this is just a 2-dimensional volume, and so basically, or area we would call that. And so let's say that you're an organism that likes a lot of light, so you could survive there, but you don't do well with moisture. Well, then this would be your niche right here. And so it would be this area. But he says there are so many different characteristics, both biotic and abiotic, so we could add temperature, food, predators, all those things. So if you think of each of those being a different dimension, then you would have this complex n-dimensional hypervolume, and it would be this shape that only a species can fill, and none of those species can overlap. So we're getting a little deep. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. So let's say we've got the orange lichen. And the orange lichen likes a lot of sunlight, doesn't do well without sunlight, but can't stand a huge amount of volume of moisture. And now if we look at the green lichen, well, the green lichen likes more moisture, but doesn't do well if we have a whole bunch of sunlight. And so basically, if we put those in the same area at the same time, we're going to see 2 niches. The first one is your fundamental niche. And so your fundamental niche is where you could live. And so in other words, for the orange one, the fundamental niche is going to be this whole area. It could live here, but when you have the green lichen show up, it can't. It's being outcompeted by that green. And so now we would have to give up this section. This actually belongs to the green. And so now the realized niche of that orange lichen is just going to be this shape right here. And so that's one way to think about a niche. Another way to think about it is simply its job. And so let's say you work in a factory. This is an early Ford assembly line. Basically, each of the workers in here have a specific job or a role within this factory. Likewise, in a coral reef, each of these corals is going to have a different role that they play within that ecosystem. And so they're constantly in competition with each other. And in fact, we have what's called the competitive exclusion principle. And that essentially means that you can never have 2 different species filling the same niche at the same time. A better way to say that is that complete competitors, in other words, 2 species that are in complete competitions, doesn't even exist. It's like a fairy tale. And so let me tell you a real story of how this actually plays out. And so this is a coyote, this is a fox, and then this is a gray wolf. And so we didn't have the gray wolf in Yellowstone Park for a long time. And so basically, when the gray wolf was gone, the coyotes started to fill that role. And they started to have weird pack-like behavior, and they started to do really well, fill niches that were at one time filled by the gray wolf. As they did that, the red fox population actually went down. They took a hit. And the reason why is that the coyotes were exploiting that niche. Well, now we reintroduce the gray wolf into Yellowstone Park. The gray wolf actually is killing coyotes by the thousands. And so when we introduced the wolf into Yellowstone Park, almost immediately 50% of the coyotes were gone. And that's because they were in competition for the same food source, the wolf and the coyote. And so the wolves would target them and kill them. And a pack of wolves against a coyote is no competition, because coyotes kind of live this solitary life. They'd simply kill them. And so basically what's happened is the wolves have now taken over that niche that was being filled by the coyote. As a result, now there's less coyotes, and so you could imagine that the red fox population is starting to take off. And so that's pretty cool. Right now, if you go to Yellowstone Park, we've seen selection, and so now we're seeing coyotes that are much larger than they used to be, and they tend to spend most of their time around the roads, so they get protection from humans. That's it. That's all I've got on the niche, and I hope that's helpful.